Hi everybody, this is our first video for Unit 2. The whole unit itself is focused on biodiversity, so today is just going to be an intro as to what is biodiversity and what are the different levels of biodiversity that we see in the living world. So biodiversity just means the diversity of life forms in an environment. So that means the variety of plants, animals, bacteria, and fungi that we see in a certain area or in the world as a whole. But biodiversity is really important. When you have high biodiversity, that generally means that your ecosystem is pretty healthy. And then we're going to look at three types of biodiversity. These are genetic, species, and habitat. So again, kind of the key thing that you should be taking away from this video is that high biodiversity means that an ecosystem or a population is generally healthier. They're more resilient, which is a word that we're going to talk about a little bit later. The first level of biodiversity is genetic diversity, and this is a measure of the genetic variation among individuals in a population. So this is going to be a reminder from biology, but every organism has DNA, and that DNA contains genes, which are just small segments of DNA. The versions of those genes can be different for different individuals. So for example, I have a set of genes that code for blonde hair, while the rest of my family has genes that code for brown hair. So these genetics are more complicated, but the idea is that there are different alleles, there's different versions of these genes within a population. So in general, this is not always the case, but just in general, large populations have more genetic variations. However, if a large population declines in number, the amount of genetic diversity that's carried by those individuals who survived is greatly reduced. This is called a population bottleneck, and it's kind of shown by this picture on the right, where we have our original population here. A bottleneck event occurs, which could be there's a drought, certain organisms die, there's a big fire or a flood or an earthquake. That causes the population to be highly or greatly reduced. The surviving population is going to have a different genetic makeup than the original population. So originally we had, you could argue, mostly orange. And in our new population, after this bottleneck effect, we have mostly red. So that's quite a big change, and those colors are just representing different versions of genes in that population. So population bottlenecks, again, just to kind of summarize, occur when a large population declines in number and the genetic diversity of that population is then reduced. Cheetahs are an example of a population that underwent a bottleneck. This happened around 11,000 years ago, and scientists have found that the current cheetah population has very low genetic diversity. Species diversity is the number of species in a region or in a particular ecosystem. So this is one step up from genetic diversity. Genetic diversity has to do with a population of the same species. Species diversity is how many species are in a region or ecosystem. So if we think back to our biomes, areas that have really extreme temperatures like the tundra and taiga have very low species diversity. You have to be a very hardy species with very specific adaptations to live in these areas, whereas areas that are generally warmer, more precipitation, like tropical rainforests, have very high species diversity. That's because there are lots of little niches or areas that organisms can kind of specialize in that environment. Now, the last level of biodiversity is habitat diversity, and this is just the variety of habitats that exist in a given ecosystem. The more habitats you have within an ecosystem, the more species that can then be supported. So habitat diversity is really important because we have lots of different types of organisms, and they generally fall into one of two categories. Those categories are specialists and generalists. So basically, specialists are species that only live in a narrow range of biotic or abiotic conditions. That means, like our koala, for example, they're herbivores. They only live in eucalyptus trees and they only eat eucalyptus. So they're specialists because their range where they live and with what they can eat is very small. Generalists, on the other hand, can live in a wide range of biotic or abiotic conditions. One example of that is the white-tailed deer. We see those around here. but they are generalists. They live throughout North and South America, and they can consume many different plants. So if one plant species were to be wiped out or to decrease in population for some reason or another, the white-tailed deer would not be as affected. Our koala, on the other hand, if they were losing eucalyptus trees, they would be super affected because they really depend on those trees to provide shelter and to provide sustenance or food. The loss of habitat, again, it leads to a loss of specialist species first, because generally they require very specific things, and then afterwards generalist species will begin to be affected. Also, when habitat loss occurs, this leads to reduced numbers of species that have large territorial requirements. So that's why it's really important to have habitat diversity, because that makes an ecosystem able to support these different types of organisms. Biodiversity can be measured or quantified by determining species richness and species evenness. So species evenness is a measure of how all the individual organisms within an ecosystem are balanced between different species. So an area that has high species evenness will have a pretty even number of organisms, or an even percentage of each different organism type. So if we look at this diagram of Area 1 and Area 2, Area 1 is more even because each of these species makes up 25% of the total organisms in that area. On the other hand, Area 2 has kind of a wide variety, but it's dominated by this one plant that's made up of that makes up 70% of those living organisms. Species richness, on the other hand, is just the number of different species in a given area. So between Area 1 and Area 2, their species richness is equal because they both have 4 different species of trees. High species richness is generally a good sign of ecosystem health, because when you have more species, it's more likely that there are some quality resources in that area. So that means lots of water availability, healthy soil with lots of nutrients will support more species. Evenness is generally used to indicate if there are 1 or 2 dominant species, or if population sizes are fairly well balanced. So why is biodiversity important? There are many benefits to the various levels of biodiversity, and the first one that we're going to talk about is ecosystem resilience. So increased biodiversity improves how populations and ecosystems respond to environmental stressors. So resilience is this ability of an ecosystem to kind of bounce back when something negative happens to it. So return to its original conditions after a major disturbance. So these disturbances can be human caused, they can be clear cutting, or they can be more natural. Some storm rolls through, a fire occurs, a flood occurs. These are all major disturbances. And then the resilience piece is, does that ecosystem bounce back and can it recover on its own? So when you have an area that has high species diversity, that means that there are more plant species to repopulate disturbed ground. They're able to anchor soil and provide food and habitat for animal species. When you have high species diversity, that means you more likely have lots of plant species that can help to repopulate the ground. Once a disturbance has occurred, they can help to then hold that soil in place if some of those plants have rapid root growth, and they can provide food and habitat for animal species, so then animals can come back to an area that has experienced a major disturbance. So genetic diversity is also really important, because the more genetic diversity in a population, the better that population can respond to environmental stressors, especially things like drought, disease, or famine. When you have more genetic diversity, that means there's a higher chance that some of the individuals have traits that will allow them to survive an environmental stressor. So this image on this slide is looking at potatoes, and we're focused on a disease in our original or our crop with diverse potatoes, so potatoes that have genetic differences. We can see that only one of these potatoes is affected by the disease. What that means is when a disease rolls through, your original crop of potatoes is not completely wiped out, but we still have 7 potatoes remaining, and only 1 has suffered from this disease. So it's important to have this genetic diversity, because if you have monoculture potatoes where you have these potatoes that are all genetically identical, a disease rolled through and the entire crop is completely wiped out. So the more genetic diversity you have, the more resilient a population can be in general, and also the less susceptible it is, especially to things like disease. So one consequence of low genetic diversity is called inbreeding depression. So this occurs in populations with low genetic diversity. For example, some populations that were affected by a natural disaster, and basically that population size has become so small that they are forced to inbreed, which means organisms are mating with closely related family members. So the population just isn't big enough to seek mates outside of that kind of core family. So this leads to a higher chance of offspring having harmful genetic mutations because they're getting similar genotypes from both parents. So genotypes, again, are your actual genetic information, your DNA that you're getting from your parents. So for example, the Florida panther had a population decrease to 30 or maybe even 20 in the 1900s, and this was due to hunting and habitat loss, so kind of combination impacted these organisms. They experienced an inbreeding depression. So one of the bad genes that was passed throughout this family is a gene for a kinked tail. So that's what this X-ray and image are showing. Also, along with that came things like heart defects, low sperm count, and undescended testicles. So not only are these Florida panthers having to inbreed with one another, they're also having a lot of trouble even getting a baby to come out of that. So what was done to mediate this is in 1955, scientists took pumas from Texas and introduced them into this population of Florida panthers in order to provide a little bit more genetic diversity to the population. And overall, this has been successful. We've seen a pretty decent rise in the populations of Florida panthers. Finally, for your practice FRQ, I want you to describe one of those 3 levels of biodiversity and explain how high biodiversity at that level is beneficial to ecosystems.